Hi, this is Andy Serwin with the second in the series of CyberSide Chats. Today we're going to talk about understanding emerging cyber threats. One thing we've seen recently is a focus on non-consumer data breaches getting a lot of media attention. And today we'll talk a little bit about obviously why that's getting a lot of attention and where these issues may be going. The reason we're seeing a lot of this is, frankly, information is a strategic asset. It's no longer a byproduct of other business activities. And so when companies create this amount of information, as we see, some business models really exist based upon the collection and processing of information. We see many more companies moving online or mobile. And so information is both more information is created, but it's also more critical than ever that those systems work and that information is gathered and processed. We see obviously companies gathering more information and trying to understand their customers better, which really in part relates to the last point, which is many companies are trying to do marketing based upon understanding their customers better. We also see the innovation economy, both in the US and frankly in other countries, really depends upon the collection and processing of information in many ways. So the short answer is that we're seeing these threats emerge because information is no longer a byproduct of other business activity, and it really is a strategic asset that companies need to understand and try to protect themselves from these emerging risks. Obviously, a core issue that we've talked about at the Lares Institute many times is the role of information and executive decision making. We see here in the quote from the Harvard Business Review, obviously part of managers working their way up the chain is to try and learn new skills and to change the way they use information and evaluate options. And so when we talk about cyber and managing risk, we're also talking about really what is a core business function for any executive, which is how do they use information? How do they gather it? How can they gather it from their company? And frankly, make better decisions for the company as a result. To illustrate the depth of the issue, obviously many people who have information regarding customers, individual customers, have been focused on these issues. But for any company, obviously many companies have significant number of employees. We've seen that risk somewhat emerge recently, but even for companies that look beyond that issue, many companies have financial information. They have proprietary confidential information, whether it's undisclosed M&A activity, marketing plans, pricing, non-disclosed IP. So there's a variety of things and issues that companies need to focus on, and these include these forms of information. Obviously, social data, machine-to-machine data is something I think we've seen a bit of and will continue to see people focus on going forward. But the point is, even if you're not a consumer-centric organization, you need to think about, really try to assess your company's risk based upon the type of information it collects as well as, or creates, as well as how much information it has. When we look at that, and again, studies at the think tank, obviously the number one category for companies based on our research was non-public proprietary information. We see consumer data coming in a close second, at least in the form of contact information, and then credit cards following behind that. But the point is, virtually every company has some form of non-public proprietary information. And as we see these threats emerge, and we need to think about how companies really can deal with that risk from a cybersecurity perspective, because it isn't simply just about protecting an individual employee's data or an individual consumer's data. So what companies should be concerned? Obviously, any company that has those forms of information where there's a high risk. There are also additional threats depending on the industry or other factors. And so critical infrastructure obviously needs to be concerned not just about the data they have, but at times the networks that they run, whether that's a power grid, whether that's something else, so that the economy and the country can be protected. Companies with extremely valuable IP obviously need to be concerned about this issue. We've seen media companies of all sort targeted by state-sponsored actors and others. And we also have a variety of other factors that may raise the risk profile, and that includes We've seen some recent attempts and some not so recent attempts to trade ahead of the market and make money in the stock market by stealing information and using that as part of a cybercrime. So even if you are not critical infrastructure, you may not have extremely valuable IP, you're not in certain industries, you need to at least think about what your risk is and whether you fit into the profile of some of the companies that have been attacked or could be attacked. So we'll talk a little bit about cybersecurity and what companies are facing and the threats, and then we'll finish up today with at least a little bit of a discussion of what companies can do to try to help themselves. The challenge is that the cyber threat really does present some unique issues that are difficult to solve. It is a somewhat unique issue in the sense that you really do have, for lack of a better term, 4 main categories of threats. And these typically are organized actors who are targeting a company. Many times cyber terrorism is something we've heard a lot about, seen somewhat in the media, but we also obviously have heard a lot about organized crime. And I think when companies think about cybersecurity, they tend to think about those 2 types of threats. The reality is that there are at least sort of 2 main other levels of threat. Hacktivists have certainly hit a number of companies and disclosed non-public information, many times to the detriment of those companies, whether that's IP, internal communications, or others. And we also see, obviously, industrial espionage. And so if you are in an industry such as defense, obviously there's national security implications for industrial espionage, but many times it may be another company trying to steal your proprietary IP, whether that's pricing or formulas or other things. But also you see at times state-sponsored actors working hand in glove with companies in other countries to try to give their companies an advantage. And so it is not to say the threat is limited to these 4 things, but I think many companies need to start thinking of these threats in these really 4 categories and how susceptible they may or may not be to an attack, and whether there's risk here that they should be really concerned about. So how do we solve these issues? Well, obviously, understanding that there is a risk and understanding what your company's risk might be is a critical first step. Many times companies don't think about it again in these issues the way we've talked about, and thinking of it that way will help you identify the risk. I think the other thing that companies need to focus on is, frankly, a lack of horizontal information sharing at times around these issues. And so what many companies do successfully as a best practice is really look at how they can share information horizontally through their organization, not just vertically, about cybersecurity, about what their risks may or may not be. And that helps them understand their information risks, obviously identify emerging threats, but it also removes some limitations on executive decision making, both in the cybersecurity space as well as in other areas. And I think if we go back to the earlier slide, executives need to understand, obviously, that they're getting the best information they can when they make a decision. And many of the things that we'll talk about in future CyberSide chats can help drive better business decisions because it drives better executive decision making in that executives are getting better information. So obviously, one of the paths here is to identify internal solutions that increase information sharing within a company. So making sure that all of the relevant stakeholders understand where information risk may or may not be and what steps have been taken, what steps should be taken to protect that information is critical. One doctrine that is out there that the Department of Defense uses is information superiority. We've talked a lot about that at the think tank, obviously in the events we've done, but also some of the writing and thought leadership we've done. And we'll link in a moment to some additional reading you can do if you'd like more information about that. But obviously, information superiority is a methodology that can help improve executive decision making as well as cybersecurity. We will cover these issues in future CyberSide chats and look forward to doing that. But I do want to link to some of the prior written work we've done, you can see we've got one really talking about CEOs and emerging threats of the 21st century, both from a critical infrastructure but a broader sense. We've got some work done around information sharing with the public and private sector, and obviously then information superiority as a way to improve executive decision making. So we will go into more detail, obviously, down the road on these, but it's important to note that there are resources out there that can help your company try to assess and mitigate some of these risks. But the first step is obviously understanding what those risks may be and whether your company has thought through those from a best practice standpoint the way it should. Thanks again for your time. Look forward to doing more CyberSide chats in the future.